The text message arrived at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Marcus Reeves felt his blood pressure spike the moment he saw the photo. His fence. His beautiful 6-month-old cedar privacy fence that he'd spent 3 weekends building by hand. Except now it sat 4 feet into his backyard, freshly relocated, with disturbed earth marking where it had stood that morning. 8 months. 8 months of Diane Pritchard, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator, making his life miserable. But this time, she'd made a mistake she couldn't talk her way out of. This time, Marcus had proof, property law on his side, and a plan that would cost her more than just embarrassment. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more satisfying justice stories. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a good person too far, the confrontation where power shifted completely, and the resolution where justice was finally served. The first part takes you inside the quiet devastation of watching someone with a title systematically dismantle your peace. Marcus Reeves wasn't a troublemaker. He was a civil engineer who bought his dream home, followed every rule, and asked for nothing but to be left alone. But Diane Pritchard saw his property as her personal project, his independence as defiance. The fence was just the final insult in a campaign of violations that had cost Marcus sleep, money, and faith in his community. What Diane didn't know was that her latest power play had crossed from harassment into something legally actionable. And Marcus had spent years learning exactly how property boundaries worked. The second part reveals the moment Marcus stopped being a victim and became something Diane had never encountered. An opponent who understood the game better than she did. The confrontation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was surgical, cold, backed by documents Diane didn't know existed and laws she'd never bothered to read. The third part shows what happens when someone who's used to winning suddenly realizes they've been playing against a stacked deck. Justice arrived with survey stakes, legal bills, and witnesses Diane couldn't intimidate. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Reeves, 42, had spent 17 years designing municipal infrastructure projects across 3 states. He understood load-bearing calculations, drainage systems, and most importantly, property surveys down to the quarter inch. When he purchased the modest ranch house at 847 Pinewood Circle 2 years ago, he'd done what any good engineer would do. Ordered a comprehensive survey, filed it with the county, and built his improvements exactly to specification. The house wasn't flashy, but it was his. Every improvement he made followed code. Every project had the proper permits. He'd even joined the HOA board initially, trying to be a good neighbor. That lasted exactly 3 months before Diane Pritchard made it clear there was only room for one person, making decisions. And it wasn't going to be the new guy with actual engineering credentials that contradicted her pet theories about drainage and setbacks. The harassment started small. A violation notice for his mailbox being non-standard, even though it matched 5 others on the street. A formal complaint about his lawn being a quarter inch too tall, measured apparently with a ruler while he was at work. Marcus had tried the reasonable approach. Attending meetings, providing documentation, explaining with charts and diagrams why her proposed drainage modifications would actually flood 3 properties, including her own. Diane responded by calling special meetings when he couldn't attend and passing modifications to the CCRs that seemed designed specifically to target his property. Then came the fence. Marcus had spent 6 weekends that spring building a 6-foot cedar privacy fence along his back property line. He pulled permits, had the survey pins located by a licensed surveyor, built it 3 inches inside his actual boundary to avoid any possible dispute. The fence was beautiful, mortise and tenon joinery, rot-resistant cedar, posts set in concrete below the frost line. It separated his yard from the community green space that backed most properties on Pinewood Circle. 2 weeks after completion, Diane appeared at his door with a violation notice. The fence was encroaching on community property and needed to be relocated immediately. Marcus had pulled out his survey documents, showed her the pins, explained that the fence was entirely on his property. Diane's response was to smile tightly and say the HOA had different documentation, and he had 30 days to comply or face daily fines. Marcus researched. He found that Diane's husband, Tom, was a retired contractor who'd done odd jobs for several board members. He discovered that 3 years ago, the HOA had quietly voted to clarify property boundaries along the green space, claiming an extra 5 feet of what were actually private yards. No proper survey, no legal documentation, just Diane's assertion and a board that rubber-stamped whatever she wanted. He tried reasoning with other board members. 2 wouldn't return his calls. 1 admitted privately that fighting Diane wasn't worth the stress. The fines started accumulating. $50 a day for non-compliance. Marcus documented everything, paid under protest, and waited. He knew that legally, the HOA couldn't actually take adverse possession of his land without a proper survey and title work. He knew Diane was overreaching, but he also knew that fighting an HOA in court cost thousands in legal fees, and Diane was counting on him backing down. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Marcus had worked late, arriving home at 6:30 p.m. to find his fence gone from its original location and reinstalled 4 feet into his yard. His back patio, which had been private, now sat exposed. The fence posts he carefully set now blocked his garden beds. And in his mailbox was a bill for $800 for emergency relocation of non-compliant structure. Marcus stood in his backyard as the spring sun set, looking at the disturbed earth where his property line actually sat. Then he pulled out his phone and started making calls. If Diane wanted to play property line games, he'd show her what happened when you moved an engineer's fence without permission. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for Saturday morning at 10, and Marcus arrived at 9:45 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio and a calm expression that made Diane visibly uncomfortable. She'd probably expected anger, threats, maybe even the kind of outburst she could use to paint him as unstable. Instead, Marcus nodded politely to the 4 other board members, gathered in the community center, and took his seat without a word. Diane opened with her prepared statement about how Marcus had repeatedly refused to comply with HOA regulations regarding fence placement, and how the board had been forced to take corrective action to protect community property. She presented photos of the fence in its original location, blown-up prints that she'd clearly prepared in advance to make her case look professional and official. Marcus waited until she finished, then opened his portfolio. The first document he laid on the table was his original property survey, signed and sealed by Jonathan Chin, a licensed surveyor who'd been working in the county for 30 years. The bright pink survey pins were clearly marked on the map, showing Marcus's property line extending exactly where his fence had originally stood. "This is the legal boundary of my property," Marcus said quietly. "Filed with county records when I purchased the home. The fence was built 3 inches inside this line. I have photos of the survey pins in the ground, time-stamped from the day before construction began." Diane's smile tightened. "The HOA has different documentation that shows. The HOA has a hand-drawn map from 2021 with no surveyor seal, no legal standing, and no basis in recorded property deeds," Marcus interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. He laid out the next document, a copy of the HOA supposed boundary clarification, with its obvious lack of professional certification. "This document has no legal validity. You can't modify property boundaries without conducting an actual survey and filing title amendments." Board member Richard Torres, a retired accountant who'd always seemed uncomfortable with Diane's more aggressive tactics, leaned forward. "Diane, you told us this was all properly documented." Marcus didn't give her time to answer. He laid out the next series of documents, photos of his fence posts, showing the concrete footings and the careful construction. Then came the photos from Tuesday evening, showing the fence relocated. his yard damaged, and most importantly, close-up shots of the disturbed earth where the original posts had been extracted. What you did on Tuesday wasn't just a violation of HOA procedure, Marcus continued. It was trespassing, destruction of private property, and illegal modification of a legally constructed structure. The fence was permitted and inspected by the county. It was built to code. And it was entirely on my property. He pulled out the next document, and Diane's face went pale. It was a receipt from Jonathan Chun for an emergency survey conducted Wednesday morning. Mr. Chun returned to my property and re-verified every boundary pin. They're exactly where they were 2 years ago, because survey pins don't move, Diane. That's the point. The fence you relocated was lawfully placed. The location you moved it to is 4 feet inside my property line and makes the fence useless for its intended purpose. The final document was an invoice. This is the cost to have my fence professionally relocated back to its original legal position. $3,200. This is the cost of the emergency survey to document your violation. $800. And this, he laid down a formal legal notice, is notification that if the HOA doesn't authorize immediate restoration of my property at board expense, I'm filing suit for trespassing, property damage, and adverse possession attempt. Diane found her voice. You can't just... I already spoke with the county permitting office and the property records division, Marcus said. They've confirmed my survey is the legal boundary. They've also confirmed that your 2021 clarification has no legal standing and should never have been enacted without proper title work. So here's what's going to happen. Marcus looked at each board member in turn, skipping over Diane entirely. The board will vote to authorize restoration of my fence at HOA expense. You'll vote to rescind all fines issued for the original fence placement. And you'll vote to conduct a proper survey of all properties backing the green space. Because I guarantee I'm not the only homeowner you've been claiming land from. Richard Torres cleared his throat. I moved to authorize the expense and restoration. Another board member, Sarah Kwan, who'd watched the entire exchange with growing concern, quickly seconded. Diane's voice cracked slightly. You can't just vote without proper discussion. All in favor? Richard said. Three hands went up. Only Diane and her closest ally abstained. Marcus gathered his documents. I'll expect the work scheduled within 7 days. And Diane? He looked at her directly for the first time. If you ever touch my property again without written authorization and a court order, I won't be bringing documents to a board meeting. I'll be bringing them to a judge. The restoration took 4 days, conducted by a professional fencing company that Marcus had personally vetted and approved. Diane was notably absent during the entire process, but her husband Tom showed up on day 2, ostensibly to observe on behalf of the HOA. Marcus, who'd taken personal leave to supervise the work, simply handed him a copy of the board meeting minutes and said nothing more. Tom left within 10 minutes. What Marcus hadn't mentioned at the board meeting was that he'd also filed formal complaints with the county about the HOA's unauthorized boundary modifications. 3 days after his fence was restored, a county inspector arrived and posted notices on 6 properties along the green space, informing homeowners that the HOA's 2021 boundary clarification was void and they were entitled to reclaim their original property lines. The community meeting that followed was unlike any Pinewood Circle had seen before. 16 homeowners showed up, many carrying property surveys they retrieved from storage or requested from title companies. Marcus watched from the back of the room as one by one neighbors realized they'd been paying to maintain strips of land that were actually their own property. Gardens they'd been told to remove had been legal. Sheds they'd been forced to relocate had been properly placed. Richard Torres, who'd assumed informal leadership of the Reform Board, made it simple. The HOA will be conducting proper surveys of all disputed boundaries at board expense. Any improvements that homeowners were forced to remove or relocate based on the invalid 2021 clarification will be eligible for reimbursement or restoration. The costs according to the emergency budget Sarah Kwan presented, would exceed $45,000. The HOA's reserves had $18,000, which meant a special assessment was inevitable unless they found another solution. That solution arrived in the form of a resignation letter. Diane Pritchard stepped down from the board effective immediately, citing health concerns and desire to spend more time with family. What she didn't mention, but what several homeowners quickly discovered through county records, was that Diane and Tom had been slowly planning to purchase the green space from the HOA in a sweetheart deal that would have given them development rights to the disputed strips of land along the boundary. The land they'd been systematically claiming from homeowners for 3 years. Marcus found out 2 weeks later from Richard, who stopped by with a bottle of bourbon and a sheepish expression. "I should have questioned her years ago," Richard admitted as they sat on Marcus's restored patio, the fence exactly where it belonged. "But she was so confident, and it seemed easier to just go along." "That's how it always works," Marcus said, watching the sunset through his cedar fence slats. "Someone with authority acts like they know what they're doing, and people assume they must be right." The special assessment never happened. The HOA took out a modest loan to cover the surveys, and 3 board members quietly contributed personal funds to the restoration costs rather than face questions about their oversight failures. Diane and Tom listed their house for sale in July and moved out of state before the closing. 2 months after the fence incident, Marcus stood in his backyard on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, surveying the garden beds he'd been able to expand back onto his own property. His fence, restored and reinforced, stood exactly where it should. The survey pins, remarked and documented, sat undisturbed at each corner. The HOA, under new leadership, had adopted actual bylaws, requiring professional surveys for any property-related decisions. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Carol, who'd been one of the first to pull her property records after his board meeting. Her fence was being installed next week, fully on her land, with HOA blessing and no violation notices. She'd attached a photo of her garden plans, finally able to use the full depth of her yard for the first time in 3 years. Marcus smiled and sipped his coffee. He'd learned something important through all of this. Sometimes justice doesn't come from avoiding conflict. Sometimes it comes from knowing the rules better than the people trying to enforce them. And as he sat there in the morning sun on property that was legally and indisputably his, Marcus understood that the best revenge wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simply being right, having proof, and refusing to back down. The fence stood where it should. The pins marked what was his. And that was enough. Across the country in Boulder, Colorado, Marine veteran and landscape architect Patricia Mendez received a certified letter from her HOA demanding she remove her unauthorized vegetable garden. Patricia read the letter twice, then pulled out the original neighborhood covenants from 1987, the ones she personally reviewed before purchase that explicitly protected edible gardens. She smiled the way she used to smile before tactical briefings and began drafting her response. The HOA president had no idea he just picked a fight with someone who negotiated actual peace treaties. But that's a story for another time.